Discussions about desire and sexuality in axial age. You can find all sorts of erotic images of art Gandhara, but we take the next step in our journey to ancient India and proceed to the topic of Bhagavad Gita. I think everyone somehow knows the main plot of Bhagavad Gita, which consists in the fact that during the great battle between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, in order to conquer fully the whole great Bharata, i.e. Mahabharata, the great India, Arjuna, when he, as a great warrior, went out on the battlefield, he suddenly doubted whether he should fight for the Pandavas or not. We're now discussing Sandal's book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, with senior courses, and in fact, Arjuna had to solve the task of the chariot, how to act ethically in this situation. And his charioteer, Krishna, strictly speaking, told him the plot of the most divine song, Bhagavad Gita, Gita, song where he outlined some basic principles of philosophy, yoga, and the perception in which it was perceived at that time. And strictly speaking, all the chapters of the Bhagavad Gita present a summary of various aspects. In the Bhagavad Gita, for the first time, perhaps after Buddhism, perhaps influenced by Buddhism, perhaps the opposite, images of the Bhagavad Gita, its earlier version, influenced Buddhism. But the category of desires was even more stigmatized, even more seemingly hissed and outlawed. And in particular, one of the chapters, in my opinion, in the 5th, Arjuna asked, "By what force doth man go to his ill unwilling, as if one pushed him that evil path?" Krishna replied, "Kama it is, passionate it is, born of the darkness, which pusheth him. Mighty of the appetite, sinful and strong is this, man's enemy. As smoke blots the white fire, as clinging rust mars the bright mirror, as the womb surrounds the babe unborn, so is the world of things foiled, soiled, enclosed in this desire of flesh." And now, in fact, probably this was the first text where the desire was stigmatized, absolutely negatively, absolutely, let's say, has been declared as something negative. Essentially speaking, the Bhagavad Gita formulates a concept called Nishkam Karma. Karma is activity, Nishkam desireless. A man has act not in accordance with his desires, but in accordance with Dharma, in accordance with his duty, which is born from something higher than the desire. It must be said that this concept of Nishkam Karma, through many, many centuries, probably 17 centuries later, depending on the date of writing of the Bhagavad Gita, appeared in European culture. The closest expression of it in European culture was Kant, who believed that a person was conscious if he did not act in accordance with his physiological desires, not in accordance with his satisfaction or something else, but he acted in accordance with his duty, with Dharma. At the same time, Kant, of course, did not read the Bhagavad Gita. Rather, he came to the same conclusions, perhaps on the basis of some similar reasoning. Without going further into the comments on the Bhagavad Gita, we will take the next step. And we want to understand that, in fact, the opinion that was expressed in the Bhagavad Gita was not the only possible one at all within the framework of the Mahabharata itself. And the Bhagavad Gita is not the only Gita that became a part of this gigantic epos. In one of the books of the Mahabharata, the Shanti Parva, there is such a plot when Yudhishthira suddenly doubted whether he should get involved in this whole story, whether he should declare an Ashvamedha, i.e. horse sacrifice, whether, roughly speaking, it was worth starting this whole proceeding of bother. After all, ultimately he was driven only by his desire. Some of his older relatives said the following, "Wait, but the ancients said," and then he quoted Kama Gita. Kama Gita is obviously the insertion of some more ancient text, and it is noticed from the first person, from the person of Kama himself. Something the text of the Kama Gita even resembles the plot of Kama Sutta from the Atharva Veda. Essentially speaking, what does Kama say about himself as part of his divine song? He says, "No creature is able to destroy me without resorting to the proper methods. If a man, knowing my power, strive to destroy me by muttering prayers, etc., I prevail over him by deluding him with the belief that I am the subjective ego within him." Thus, as a man wanted to overcome desire, he already wanted, so the desire has not disappeared anywhere. If he wishes to destroy me by means of sacrifices with many presents, I deceive him by appearing in his mind as a most virtuous creature amongst the mobile creation. The desire to make a sacrifice is a desire, which means that Kama cannot be defeated by desires. And if he wishes to annihilate me by mastering the Vedas and Vedantas, I overreach him by seeing into his mind to be the soul of virtue amongst the immobile creation. It means, again, that the desire to learn is still a desire. And if the man whose strength lies in truth desire to overcome me by patience, I appear to him as his mind, and thus he does not perceive my existence. After all, a man suffers with patience because he wants to endure. And if the man of austere religious practices desire to destroy me by means of asceticism, I appear in the guise of asceticism in his mind, and thus he is prevented from knowing me. A person devotes itself into asceticism because he wants to devote himself selflessly. And finally, and the man of learning, who with the object of attaining salvation desires to destroy me, I frolic and laugh in the face of such a man intent on salvation. I am the everlasting one without a compeer, whom no creature can kill or destroy. It was the Kama Gita, i.e., so said Kama. This hymn, essentially speaking, is to some extent a philosophical objection to the idea of Nishkam Karma. Is such an action possible that really would not have any connotations to desire? By the way, another 18 centuries passed, and almost literally, these same words were written in the most famous work of Marquis de Sade, when he wondered, can we say that a man who seeks righteousness overcomes his desires? No, he seeks righteousness because he is driven by desires. Paradox? You see another culture, another tradition, and people repeat the same words. Why? Maybe because these words are quite logical. And so the question arose, and this question arose both within the framework of Buddhism and within the framework of Hinduism. Can a person without desires actually act? As part of Buddhism, this question was asked by an eminent logician, partly a mystic, but first of all a logician, Dinanga, who asked the question in the following way. If Buddha conquered all his desires, then what motivated Buddha to help other sentient beings? Why did he become Buddha? Why did he not ignore all them? Although he couldn't ignore all them, because for that you need to want to do it. Paradox? Certainly the paradox. The paradox which is connected with the fact that the very essence of desire has not yet been fully understood. Yes, Dinanga gave some of his own answers. He, like many after him, divided the desire into the higher and the lower ones. And the lower ones are those that need to be disposed of, the kama, and the higher ones are the highest desires, the highest wisdom. In fact, some Brahmi Vihara or some Prajna Paramita. So you don't need to get rid of these highest desires. But somehow we understand that this is a weak explanation. It is not enough just to divide it into the higher and the lower kamas. We lack here some kind of grace. So the question is, can a person act without desire? And how to understand what is the desire? Strangely enough, this question was answered in the framework of Indian culture, but it was not given in the framework of one of the major philosophical or religious traditions. But it was given by the author of the Kama Sutra, Vatsyayana Malananga. Moreover, you need to understand, of course, that the Kama Sutra is not a text that lists erotic poses or techniques of love jolts. If you go to any bookstore on the shelves with the Kama Sutras, in fact you will find a set of erotic pictures. In fact, of course, these are not the real Kama Sutras, because the Kama Sutra itself is a rather complex philosophical treatise. This is the Shastra. The Shastra, in Indian understanding, is a science. It means the science of systemic presentation, of the study of a field. And, essentially speaking, the Kama Sutra, this was the Shastra that explored the Kama as a significant aspect of human life. And already in the initial chapters, in the second chapter, Vatsyayana raised a fundamental and extremely non-obvious question. Is the enjoyment of the animal and the human being identical? Indeed, quoting the previous Kama Shastra classics, the texts of which, unfortunately, for the most part have not reached us, he has wondered. Some people think that a man does not need to be taught the Kama, since any animal is able to mate and enjoy life. However, is the desire of a man somehow different? And Vatsyayana in his text proves, no, the desire of a man is not the same as the desire of an animal. It is fundamentally different, and therefore it needs to be studied and it needs to be taught. As well as this topic about the higher and lower desires. Is the desire, for example, a sexual attribute of an animal? And Vatsyayana answers this question. Then we will discuss how. Should a person learn to enjoy, or the possibility to enjoy is sown into a man in a natural way? And finally, what is the desire in general, and what is the enjoyment in general? These are all pretty complicated questions, and, nevertheless, Vatsyayana managed to give a completely ingenious answer to all these questions. Essentially speaking, this answer was to some extent contained in the very definition of the desire that Vatsyayana gave. In the laws of Manu, the Kama was defined as a consequence of Sankappa. The desire is the intention and direction of consciousness. But what does this mean? Vatsyayana gave a completely different, much more complex definition. Vatsyayana determined that Kama, here we cannot wonder without the Sanskrit text. Because as it should be in a normal Sanskrit text, it has several decoding options. It has several levels of meaning, and depending on our understanding, we will see different elements. Vatsyayana said that the Kama is some kind of activity, pravriti, of sense organs. He lists them. Shratras, ears, tvak, skin, chakshu, eyes, jihava, tongue, gahrana is the nose, which are associated with relevant items, but which are manasa adhisthana, which are guided by the manas. Through the Atmasanyukta, the most adequate translation of these words, through self-control. So it turns out that enjoyment requires manas, mind, and B, self-control of the sense organs. What is this about? In fact, despite the apparent complexity, the idea is completely understandable. If we want to enjoy the taste of food, to delight our jihiva, the tongue, rasa, with taste, we need to prepare complex foods. We need a complex ritual. If while we bought food, we carried it home, we took a bite off here, then there, then we would not get complete enjoyment of a complex meal. Or, for example, if we want to enjoy good wine, but we do not understand wine, then we simply understand, yes, red liquid, yellow liquid. So we are not able to understand the whole bouquet. We are not able to understand all the notes of smell, all nuances of taste, etc. This needs to be learned. For this, internal discipline is needed. This is the very Atmasanyukta. In the same way, if we want to enjoy some kind of sexual experience, create some kind of complex sexual context, but didn't resist and have masturbated along the way, then in general, most likely, by the time we get to bed, or to some other experience we were going to get, this experience that we had planned would be no longer so bright as we had thought. In essence, human experience is connected with the ability to direct the sense organs and with the discipline of the sense organs. And in this sense, you understand that this is the answer to the question, are the experiences of animals and the man identical? No, because animals do not control their senses, so their enjoyment is much weaker than human enjoyment. Animals have no mind, so they are not able to send the senses in the right direction. They cannot concentrate themselves. And understanding this, we are already beginning to understand from this definition it becomes clear why Kama has a flower bow and why he has 5 arrows. Because the flower bow is exactly one of the symbols of the manas in the Indian tradition, and the 5 arrows are the 5 senses. The flower bow is necessary to truly experience the enjoyment. The meaning of this bow is not quite the same as we remembered with Cupid, who hit the people in the heart. This was such an exoteric meaning of this symbol. The esoteric meaning is that in order to reach the Kama, you need to be able to discipline each of the senses in such a way as to direct it directly to the goal. To concentrate yourself on the experience. To keep your state in a state of the self-control until the experience becomes really sophisticated, really polished, and really exquisite. This is the essence of what Vatsyayana said. But in fact, there is another sense in this definition. The fact is that this category is Atma Sanyukta. It can be read in another way. Atma, or Atman, one of the dictionary meanings is the body. Samyukta is a connection. And in this sense, we can say that the manas not only directs, but it is also the manas that does it through the connection to the body. And again, we understand that the genuine Kama, the genuine enjoyment, is possible only if you experience the sensation physically, in and by the body. Then, many years later, 1,500 years later, in Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra, it will be said, moksha, liberation, is impossible without a body. But while the Kama Sutra says the following, the Kama is impossible without the deepest attachment to the body. After all, even if we now take some psychological, let's say, problems, a person tries to enjoy something, and then once he was distracted from it by the phone, and that's all, at this moment he is not in the body, his consciousness, vikshipta, is distracted. Correspondingly, it is no longer possible for a person to enjoy by the genuine Kama as intended. This is the second meaning, which is simultaneously present in the same statement. And the third, maybe not the meaning, but just a curious connotation. What connects this statement with yoga? The word yukta is a favorite word in Bhagavad Gita. The root of the word yukta is the root of yuj, the same root that stands in the word yoga. Yukta is the word controlled. The yukta is one of the synonyms of yoga. In getting here, yes, of course, Vatsyayana did not mean yoga, let's be honest, so that there would be not such unhealthy linguistic freak connotations. But it was the fact that he understood the connection between self-control and experience. Yoga is primarily the self-control, as the name implies. At least philosophically, for Vatsyayana, these two notions are two planes, two ritual spaces that are deeply connected. The whole Kama Sutra, essentially speaking, if we study it carefully, is built and devoted precisely to these problematics, to the problematics of a deep differentiation of internal states and the deep construction of some experiences. There is a magnificent translation of the Kama Sutra into Russian, which Sirkin did. It is better than the classical English translation and all the translations from English, because in the first English translation of the Kama Sutra, some of the chapters that seemed at that time insufficiently chaste were cut out, and new translations into English have already been made in 50 years. Therefore, if you take, for example, some translation into Russian, made not from Sanskrit, then most likely it will be from that wrong text. Although there are already modern normal translations of the Kama Sutra, but I must say that in this sense, the translation of Sirkin was even ahead in something. It is available on the internet, it can be read, and in principle, enjoy this deep text. I will show you only 2 examples of the realization of this very idea that genuine Kama, enjoyment, is associated with deep self-control. There are 2 sections in the Kama Sutra where a certain classification of types of the priti is given, i.e. types of anahata love, types of sympathy for a man, and classification of types of the rati, passionate love, sexual experiences to a man. And now, having read it, we can understand how subtly the authors, and perhaps, respectively, his contemporaries have been reflecting these experiences. And you understand that the Kama Sutra was written 2,000 years ago, right? Plus or minus 2 centuries, but that's not important. 10% is not an error. Here, for example, types of the priti, types of love sympathy. I called it love sympathy simply because it's very difficult to translate this word into Russian. The term abhyasa is probably well known to you, exercise. Remember, in the Yoga Sutra, it says abhyasa vairagyam nirodha. Thanks to abhyasa and vairagya, nirodha is achieved. Abhyasa is an exercise. But what is abhyasa in the priti context? This is the sympathy that arises from the constancy of the exercise, from the constancy of being together, from performing together the usual actions. In fact, it is the love associated with the habit of one to another. But the habit is not in the bad sense of the word. It is a class of emotional experiences. People get used to one another. People were adapting one to another. People feel each other. People get used to doing something together. They have a feeling of unity. Isn't it interestingly described? Or another experience, love is associated with the abhimana. Abhimana is from the root man, to think, which you think towards, literally. It means this is love or affection, which is connected, on the contrary, with the fact that you know a person not too good, and in your head, you think out some fantasies about him. You imagine what he or she could be, what kind of experience it is, what it might look like. And looking for something in this person, even without seeing him and physically, you light up with a specific sympathy towards him. But this is another experience. Has, let's say, the average man of the street ever thought about the difference between these experiences? And note, Vatsyayana did not indicate that one of these was better and another was worse. They were just different, and you need to very clearly understand the nature of your experience and enjoy this very experience. And there is an experience, for example, the sampratyaya, the name pratyaya, pratyaya, movement towards, conjoint movement one towards another. For example, if a certain person, let's explain, the sampratyaya is the love that arises in return. After all, if a person emotionally invests in us, feels a sympathy for us, so does this person remain for us the same among other people? Of course not. When we feel sympathy from another person, we feel reciprocal sympathy. And this is a certain class of experiences. And finally, love, visaya, subject, love, literally that arises as a result of sensual attraction to each other, which is realized in the form of physical actions. When people meet, they have sex, they have vivid experiences between them, and in these experiences, not only rati, passion, but also priti, mutual attraction, begin to develop. Note, 4 different experiences. In general, Vatsyayana didn't say anything completely incomprehensible. But did we often pay attention to the nature of our experiences with another person? After all, in order to pay attention to it, again, we need some kind of reflexivity, and we need some kind of discipline in order to distinguish these experiences among themselves. Vatsyayana weighs in also with no less interesting types of passion, the raga. He describes the following, for example, that there is a passion that he called ragavat, raga-like, attraction. This passion, as he describes it, which arises between people who have not seen each other for a long time. They were prevented by something from seeing each other. It means they finally met, reached each other, and began to... Remember how in the Russian group Zveri, animals, in the clip of the song, Everything That Touches You, young couples were dressing, trying on clothes to make an impression on each other at the meeting, but as they met, they began to undress suddenly, unseen all around them, without noticing erotic clothing on them, led by passion. This is one type of passion. There is aharya raga, which it is a passion. The root her means to pull, pulled passion. When there was a sympathy between people, but as they began to have sex, each other, this sympathy increased because their mutual excitement increased, unwound. This is a different type of experience. And katri raga, the root of kur, to do, this is created raga. Created attraction, created passion, artificial passion. It means the passion which is created with the help of beautiful underclothes, beautiful surroundings, erotic highlights, etc. Maybe initially people did not have this strong excitement, but they wanted to taste each other, to experience something together, Each was properly prepared, and a certain type of mutual attraction arose in this preparation. Vyayavahita raga, the root of th, transferred from one object to another. When there was a strong attraction towards one person, but since it was not realized with the person in question for some reason, it could be realized with another person. At the same time, in essence, the third is informally or not physically present in this relationship. We have sex with someone, meaning some other, in fact. This is a context for three persons. Pataratam raga, sex with servant girls, in the sense of kahala raga, the sex if and when necessary. These types of sex are related to each other. That's when the desire arose not to a specific person, but simply the desire to have sex with someone. In this case, servant girls are recommended to men, and elephant drivers and nearby villagers are recommended to women. In this sense, I thought that the image of an elephant driver as a prototype for a modern car driver, as well as the image of nearby villagers to be used, led me to the idea that a porno with a swimming pool cleaner and a plumber had very ancient and very respected roots. It's just so languidly around, parrots chipper, Vasanta spring has come, etc. In principle, it's not the case of any particular connections with someone, but he has met in my way, so why not? And finally, ayantra raga, from mutual trust. I would say that translated into some modern language is a passion that arises between friends. It means friendly sex. People have known each other for a long time, they trust each other, they have had some experiences between, well, in general, why not to have sex along the way? With that, maybe there was not such a strong passion. But how subtle, how polished, and deep differentiation of all these experiences. That's when we say that in order to enjoy wine, you must at least know the nature of the bouquet. Or in order to enjoy the smell of some perfume, you need to be able to decompose it into some elementary components. So here, in order to enjoy the experiences and relations with people, it is necessary to understand all these opportunities to accept. In this aspect, of course, the Kama Sutra is unmatched in the sensation of subtle reflexivity, differentiation, and indication of possibilities. And what is interesting, Vatsyayana himself, even when he entered some jungle in his reflections that already contradicted the current Dharma, current recommendations of the Dharma Shastra, he said in such a way, I don't say that it's good, but it would be wrong for a pundit to not specify such a possibility. Great wording. So if there is such a possibility, this degree of freedom must be felt. And then the whole depth of your experiences is a measure of your cultural state. Here's a little bit about Vatsyayana. Enjoyment is based on the deep inner culture, and it would be interesting to disassemble such a phenomenon as the names of the god Kama. I have already said that Indian culture is structured in such a way that when we talk about gods, essentially speaking, this is some kind of cultural code which contains important information about experiences, archetypes, the essence of what is happening, etc. For example, if we take the same names of Kama, then the Amarakosha lists 19 names, although I found lists up to 50 names of Kama, and each name expresses, in essence, a description of a certain psycho-emotional state that is associated with this deity. For example, one of the names of Kama is Smara, memory. Why? Because if we are in love, we naturally remember the person we love or want. It means we don't need to recall him or her. This concerns, by the way, not only people. If we forget something, then we don't really want it, because what we want, we never forget. Therefore, Kama is at the same time Smara. Kama is also Mara, which means death. Why? Because love transcends a person. Desire transcends a person. It takes him beyond the bounds of himself. It means when we experience strong feelings, we're no longer the same person who approached the situation before these feelings arose. Love transforms, so kama is Mara. Kama is Madana, ecstasy, drunkenness, because drunkenness allows us to see the world from a little different angle. Why do people actually drink? Sure, if they are not drunkards. In order to experience some other states. To look at the world in a more holistic and less analytical way. In drunkenness, we do not pay attention to details, therefore the similar experience gives us love. Manmatha is embarrassing the mind, because the root math is to mix, to churn, to whip up sour cream. Accordingly, churning the mind, it means to come to confusion. Manasija is born in mind. Ananga, incorporeal, he lives only in the bodies of other people. And so on. In this sense, even meditation on these names, there are many of them, can be considered as the goal and method of a separate meditation. We saw this, as we can say, one way in which Indian culture moved in the aspect of understanding kama and in the aspect of coming out of this dialectical problem. Whether or not a person without desire is able to act, it means the question that everything is a desire, or vice versa. You need to get rid of desires completely. In fact, found some such synthetic solution. Desire and enjoyment are a function of control. We have solved this dialectical problem in such a way. But there were other ways to solve this problem. These methods were laid, as usual, in the earliest Upanishads. And in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the oldest surviving Upanishad that has come to us, a certain hymn was already given, which was dedicated to a different attitude to what was happening, to a different attitude to the general act of sexual desire or sexual act. In the Brihadaranyaka, at least there are two such passages, and one of the passages sounds as follows. Woman, O Gautama, this is the participant in the conversation, is the fire, her sexual organ is the fuel, the hairs, the smoke, the vulva, the flame, sexual intercourse, the cinders, enjoyment, the sparks. In this fire the gods offer semen as libation. Out of this offering a man is born. He lives as long as he is to live. Out of this offering a man is born. What is this passage about? Here we are talking about the sacralization of desire. One way is to control and suppress desire, and the other way is to expand desire and see something more meaningful, more ambitious, more highly contextual in this desire. Another line from the same Upanishad, chapter 4, Conception and Birth as Religious Rites, verse 3, in Russian, the translation of the same Sirkin. Her lap is the sacrificial altar, her hair the sacrificial grass, her skin within the organ the lighted fire. Then in Russian, labia pudenda, fire in the middle. In English, another translation, the two labia are the two stones of the soma, press. And it is very interesting translation into Russian, labia pudenda, in fact. Sirkin preserved socialist chastity and translated the labia not into Russian but into Latin, and everything became, so to speak, a little more cultural. He who, knowing this, practices sexual intercourse wins as great a world as is won through the Vijapaya sacrifice. He acquires for himself the fruit of the good deeds of the woman. Essentially speaking, sex becomes not something forbidden, but with the right condition and the right attitude, sex, like any action, becomes a ritual act. It becomes sacred, becomes meaningful, and it expands a person. Subsequently, we will see this idea in later tantras expressed in, I'll explain it in a little more detail. Let's go back to the Victorian translations topic. There is a very funny story about these passages. One of the first translations of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishads was made by the famous Sir Monier Williams, who wrote the famous dictionary. He translated these Upanishads into English, being a sir, and now we can read this translation into English. Well, of course, if we can read Sanskrit. In short, in the book, which was entirely translated into English, this passage remained in Sanskrit only in transliteration. I understand that people who buy Upanishads in English most likely do not know Sanskrit, because if they'd known, they would have bought the Upanishads in Sanskrit. That being said, this piece was not translated, and in the English version, it became translated only 50 years later. At least it was not understood by non-specialists. Specialists, of course, could read. But as to the specialists, are there many Sanskrit specialists? In England, probably a little more than in Ukraine. I once bought a book in London and just put me in a state of wild laughter because of the thickness of the book. 850 pages. With this, the title says simply, the Rig Veda for the lazy. It was the Rig Veda, where the hymns were described in words and the grammatical turns were well explained. 850 pages. So, for a lazy man, I realized that laziness may be different. It was graded by levels, like love or passion. But this passage, which we see, can be said as a prototype of many other passages which we will see later. I must say that the idea of sacralization of desire, like the sacralization of sexual relations, had a very powerful influence on medieval, early than later Indian poetry. And the next great example about this is an example of erotic lyricism that originated in the framework of Krishnaism. If you take the classic plots of Krishnaism, they are built around love. This is love lyrics, Radha and Krishna. You are the husband of some beautiful woman, and I am the wife of another man, etc. And they meet somewhere on the banks of the Yamuna, running away from their families. They roam the forests and pastures of Vrindavan. They dance with the shepherd girls, etc. It means that all these plots, if you read them, they're full of incredible beauty, lyrical, and erotic. And it can be said that one of the most striking works in this sense is the so-called Gita Govinda, which means Govinda's song. It would probably be more correct to say. This work is quite late, about the 13th century, but it is largely translated into Russian, and they are pretty good translations. Probably, it is impossible to translate Indian poetry in its pure form. Without changing the rhythm, it would be terribly difficult, but this text amazes with its deep descriptions of all possible states. The plot is that there is, again, Krishna, there is Radha, they separate for some time, and each of them experiences in detail and describes the essence of those states. When he or she misses another, he or she is angry with the other, that he or she has not come yet, he or she regrets that he or she was angry, was jealous, he or she conquered jealousy in himself, they met again, etc. Each of these states is described. The chapters are divided into emotional states, and each of these emotional states is a real masterpiece. I will not set forth the entire text, but it is interesting that the Gita Govinda paves some parallels between love, emotional experiences, and yogic emotional experiences. For example, at the beginning of the 3rd chapter, I think, there is such a plot when Karsar is Krishna, it means the one who killed Kars, having established Radha in his heart, left other beautiful women. Radha here is a chain limiting sansaric vasanas. This is very interesting, that it's a synonym for Radha, Samara Vasana Bandha Srinkalam, where Srinkala is a chain, Bandha connecting, Vasanas. Remember, what is Vasana? Karma is spread through samsaras and vasanas. What means through some unconscious inclinations. And it turns out that the love for a woman is a source for a man. In this case, a source to connect these samsaric desires, because love is above some momentary desires, love is above some beliefs. ideas, principles, etc. And all this is the essence of samsara. But this is not obvious, is it? This is precisely the sacralization of the experience. Similarly, if we look at the experience of Radha in the Gita Govinda, in the described situation, here is a beautiful picture when Radha misses Krishna. It's available in Russian translation. Devoting herself to contemplation, imagining that you, so inaccessible, appear in front of her, she groans, laughs, despairs, etc. But if we look at the Sanskrit version, we will see only Dahyana Layena, being dissolved in Dahyana. In essence, the experience of missing a lover is equated here, remember, to the seventh anga of yoga, Dahyana. Dahyana, you remember, this is some deep concentration which creates a new understanding. This is the deepest level of concentration. But after all, notice that the concentration that we evoke through our volitional efforts, practicing ordinary yoga, through pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, a person in love experiences naturally. Remember, kama is smara, it is remembrance. It is achieved in a completely natural way. Here is such a funny moment. And finally, here I lost the second Sanskrit line. Depressed by separation, she seemed to be in fear of the eroticism of Manasiji, the god of love. And she plunged mentally into you. She plunged into you, and we understand that this is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. In the Bhagavad Gita, there is an experience when he who plunges by his thoughts into me is a true yogi, etc. The 12th chapter of the Bhakti Yoga. But a person who is already in love has already plunged by his thoughts into another person. He opened up to his inner world and mixed their inner worlds. Here is such an unexpected move. In fact, in Indian lyrics, there are many such analogies. And to finish the topic, let's see what impact the erotic Indian lyrics had on Europe. The fact is that you probably know that the category love and love experiences, love languor, and everything that we are talking about on this subject arose in the European tradition around the 12th century in France, thanks to the so-called culture of the troubadours. The love of the troubadours, who were singing of the love for the beautiful lady, and not necessarily with this lady he had to be in a sexual relationship. It could be someone else's wife or mistress. They identified 3 types of love. And it has already been proven that the ideas of the troubadours were largely influenced by Persian and Arabic poetry, which Europe had encountered at that time. In turn, Persian poetry is a derivative of Indian lyric poetry. And in this way, Europe has recognized the category of love in general, and thought about this category largely due to the erotic lyrics of early medieval India. It's interesting. There were other variants of sacralization and transcendence of this image of love. And in some places it is expressed by rather unexpected images. Here in this picture, we see such a funny deity, funny from an intellectual point of view. On the one hand, this deity has many attributes of Shiva Bhairava. The main attribute, you know, is the dog, because in all other guises, Shiva rides the bull, Nandin, which translates as Nanda, to enjoy, to be in bliss. But in this case, Shiva has all the attributes, sits in the form of Aghori, holds a skull Kapala in his hand, but he sits astride a parrot. He sits astride a parrot, and the parrot is traditionally the riding animal, Vakhana, of the god Kama in the Indian lyrics. In fact, we see the fusion of the image of Shiva and the image of Kama. Unfortunately, besides the picture itself, I did not manage to find any descriptions of the nature of this deity, where it came from, and so on. But I leave no hope. Although the idea seems quite understandable, after all, Shiva is worshipped in the form of a linga, which means that it is also the Lord of desires. Why not identify him with the image of the god Kama? The next image, the next act of sacralization is even more unexpected, and we will delight people who understand Buddhism. The fact is that early Buddhism initially rejected desire, but as Buddhism synthesized with tantric elements in Buddhism, the category of desire reappeared and again became quite relevant. And even a specific deity appeared whose name is Vajra Ananga Manjushri. Vajra is diamond, Anang disembodied. But here it is still more cunning because by itself the word Vajra, generally speaking, in one of the meanings means linga. So everything is deeper here. What is interesting about this deity? Those who know a little Buddhist iconography will immediately see that the two upper arms of this deity expressly bear the attributes of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, which is responsible for sacred knowledge. The sword of Manjushri is a sword of vidya. It is a sword of distinguishing knowledge, a sword of analysis that destroys delusion, possible vikalpas, etc. In essence, Manjushri is wisdom, but the two lower hands of this deity carry the attributes of Kama, the bow and arrows. And if we can still doubt, well, bow and arrows, so what? But in fact, no, it is no coincidence with these bow and arrows. In the other image, it is completely obvious that these are not just the bow and arrows, but the flower arrows, attributes of Kama. Here is an image already, a Thanka of Kama Manjushri. And what is most interesting is that I managed to find the mantra of this deity, which excludes any reflections on the fact that it is not a fusion of Kama and Manjushri. I began to translate it into Russian, and I realized that this mantra is very interesting. It is written in a tantric shadow language, because it has two interpretations. I will try to explain them. The fact is that the top two lines of this mantra can be translated in two ways. Kamuka, the last word, second line, is a lover who Smaran remembers. But further, what he remembers. There are two options. Who remembers at least Vihval, a moment about this deity can acquire Kamin Im, a girl, a mistress who is Abhimatam, desired. Manoharinim steals his mind. Madhavihvalam makes him drunk. Immediately. But you can read in a different way, in this version. And here I worship this Arya Manjushri. And thus we see that this mantra in this version is nothing but a love filter mantra. It means this deity can be addressed in order to obtain the desired partner. But this is only one interpretation of this mantra. The second interpretation is the opposite. Let's note that both words, Manjushri and girl, used here are inflected for the second case. And you can read in such a way that his lover, Kamuka, who is Smaran, remembering, about this beautiful woman who steals the mind, immediately acquires Manjushri. Clear? It means in one version it is a love filter mantra, and in another version it is a certain philosophical statement about the fact that a person who feels a love experience also experiences transcendental wisdom. This is already not obvious. Although in general it is obvious somewhere, because strictly speaking, who said there, the road to the palace of wisdom lies across the road of excesses. So what is my opinion? It really depends on the translation. But in fact, for us, in order to understand even more subtly what the author of this mantra hints at, note that the principle smaran is also smara, remembering. It means Kamuka is a lover who is smaran. He is in a state of smara, and we understand that another bridge is crossed between the god Manjushri and the god of love, Kama. Although in traditional Buddhism, Manjushri is a categorically asexual deity. About this, few people know, but nevertheless, I am glad that we can reflect a little on this. So these are the unobvious Buddhist associations.